In the last video, we talked about constructors, instance variables, defining classes, and then we left off on this notion of what happens if we rename these instance variables. Okay? So what happens is that now we have to change them wherever they're referenced. And that's a problem for a couple of reasons, but there's another sort of issue with what we've done so far. So we can not only reference x and y, we can also change x and y. So if we want to set the x value or the x coordinate of p to be 100, we can do that. Okay? We can do that without even being inside of the class. So what happens is that if we change it out here, it's going to be changed inside of the object as well. And that's not a good practice, or at least this idea is not a very good practice. Okay? So one thing that we can do, first of all, is say that these variables are final. Okay? So for now, we're going to say that classes are just immutable wrappers around data. Okay? Later, we will change this paradigm, and in fact, in one of the next few videos, we will show an instance of a variable that is not final. But for now, we just want to say that when we have a point with two coordinates x and y, we're only going to define them once inside of the constructor, and then once they are assigned, they cannot be reassigned. Okay, that's what final means. So this will no longer compile. We cannot reassign x or y to be different values. Okay? But there's still another issue, that we're trying to access data directly through the class. And this is just... So Java programmers will go back and forth on whether this is a good idea or whether it's not a good idea. In my opinion, it's not a good idea to expose private data into a scope that it does not need to be accessed in. Okay? So what we can do is we're going to make these variables private. So remember, the last time that we saw private was when we were making private static methods. Private variables, private instance variables, can only be accessed inside of the defining class. Okay? So we can only access x and y when we're inside of the point class. And one thing I'll also note before we go further is that I always use this dot to reference instance variables. Now, in the last video, I said that this is only a significant problem when you what's called shadow the variables. So if we say that we have x and y, lowercase x and y, then if we don't have this dot, then we will shadow this x will shadow, and this y will shadow this y, and this x will shadow this x. Okay? So we put this dot to say that we want this x to be assigned to the parameter, and this y to be assigned to the parameter. Okay? But one thing I will also note is that final variables should be typed in what's called capital case. And what that means is we have all the words in capital with spaces, so to speak, represented as underscores. Okay? So we'll change this back to this. But now the question is, how do we, what if we want to use these x and y variables? Obviously we can't just have them be defined in this class and then never use them again. And indeed, you wouldn't do that. So what you would do is use something called accessor methods. An accessor method is nothing more than something that returns a private attribute of the class. Okay? So we're going to define two accessor methods, one that's called getX and one that's called getY. And what these will do is just return the x coordinate and the y coordinate respectively. Now, out here, we're going to say p.getX and p.get y. And again, why do we do this? This seems very superfluous and verbose. And indeed, it is verbose, but the reason why we do it is, again, to emphasize this practice in Java that's called encapsulation. We want to reduce access to private values as much as possible, or rather just variables or attributes as much as possible. Only people who have defined access, or only certain things, only certain locations, so to speak, should have direct access to instance variables of a class. Because if someone can change them willy-nilly or access them willy-nilly, then you may end up accidentally overwriting instance variables by accident, and also you may, how do I want to phrase this? If you just have unrestricted access to it, then there's not really a point in it being an instance variable, okay? You could probably represent it as something else, okay? So that's not the best explanation in the world, admittedly, but this is a very common practice in Java. So accessor methods, or sometimes they're called getters, they retrieve the values of an instance variable. So we have a getX for this x and a getY for this y. Now, these don't have to be named getX and getY. They could be named get coordinate x or get coordinate y or whatever. But it's generally a good idea, or it is a good idea, to be consistent with how you name your accessor methods. Okay? So now if we rerun this, we see that it becomes 7. Okay? So we assign them over in the constructor, and then we retrieve them with the accessors. And remember that we said that instance variables should be final and they should be private. Okay? So in a later section, or in a later video of this section, in fact, we will see that not all instance variables should be final. All instance variables should be private. Okay, that is something I will stand by. But not all instance variables will be final.